This month we explore the Ezekiel Harris house on Broad Street in Harrisburg. This historical home is maintained by the Augusta Museum of History, and students have been taking tours of it for decades. But who was Ezekiel Harris?
He was a tobacco merchant. Tobacco was the original cash crop in this area.
Not much is known about Ezekiel Harris because very few primary sources from him exist. What we do know comes from old newspaper articles and court documents. Records suggest that Harris fought for the Americans during the Revolution, and he came to Georgia from Edgefield, South Carolina in the late 1790s. He purchased more than 300 acres, which he named Harrisburg, and built his home overlooking the Savannah River. Augusta University historian Dr. Leanne Caldwell says Harris had a reason for his choice of location.
Behind me, what we call Broad Street, was the original pathway that the Native American peoples used to come down to the Savannah River.
Harris was very wealthy, which he showed off with his large house and expensive architecture. According to historical records, Harris was a slave owner. He had big plans for Harrisburg and hoped it would eventually be bigger than Augusta.
And so he was hoping to become master of his 323.5 acres. He was an owner of enslaved people, not many, probably house servants and people who worked around here, because he wasn't really a planter. He grew corn, and so he needed extra labor, he thought.
Harris focused on business, and some of his business practices made him enemies. Dr. Caldwell wrote in a paper that competition among tobacco merchants in the Augusta area was fierce, and much of the controversy was centered around Harris.
John Hammond owned a ferry. Ezekiel Harris owned a ferry. Ezekiel Harris made his ferry free so that he could attract more people to him and to this side of the river. Hammond was angry because that was cutting into his business. At one point, they found Hammond's ferry chopped up.
She says Hammond sued Harris, and sometime during the feud, Harris's ferry was burned. Not long after, Hammond was shot to death in his yard and his house was burned down. It couldn't be proven, but many believe Harris was responsible. For decades, a ghost story was tied to the house. It has since been debunked.
At one time, the thought was, or the story was, that there were 13 patriots. This was after the first siege of Augusta, which happened right down the road here. There were 13 patriots that were supposedly hung on this porch. Well, the revolution ended in 1783. The house wasn't built until 1797, and that's what I've had to explain to people. So it could not have happened. Now, did the 13 patriots get hung? Absolutely.
Nancy Glazer, the executive director of the museum, says the confusion came because the Ezekiel Harris house was thought to be the Mackey trading post for a long time. As for Ezekiel Harris, Dr. Caldwell says he died in 1829, nearly penniless.
But he didn't always manage his business very well. As a result of some of these court cases and judgments against him, he sold off pieces of his 323.5 acres. And eventually he did what a lot of people do when they get in debt. He moved. And in his case, he moved west to Washington, Georgia, and that's where he died.
That's a key in understanding what's going to happen in the future if you understand what's happened in the past. So keeping these properties, whether it's an historic home, whether it's an historic downtown building, it's important to keep these buildings properly preserved.
The Ezekiel Harris house is open for tours Monday through Friday by appointment only, and on Saturday from 10 a.m. to 5 p.m. for walk-ins. For more on this historic home, including the ghost story that was attached to it for decades, just go to our website, WJBF.com. And that's your hometown history. In Augusta, Kim Vickers, WJBF News Channel 6.